So I don't know that it's ever been said of a JET conference before, but we're actually ahead of schedule and feeling wonderful. So I'm actually very excited for that. Our next section will be the history of the JETAA ecosystem, which will consist of a presentation from Matt Gillam, leading us through of our history as an organization, followed by a panel discussion where we'll invite Shannan Spisak, as well as Paige Cottingham-Streater, to join us in that discussion. So it's going to be a really interesting one, and I'm really glad that I can steal a few extra minutes to allow that discussion to continue longer than expected. So in order to allow Matt plenty of time, let's go ahead and without further ado, get him up to speak about our history. Matt, do you have your sharing rights and you're able to share your screen?
Oh no, I just checked host disabled screen sharing. I guess you don't trust me. So
we do. We will get you those sharing rights, Matt. Just give us 1 second.
Thanks.
Would you, in the meantime, Matt, would you like to give a brief introduction of yourself, although you may be someone who needs no introduction within our community?
Yeah, for the 3 or 4 of you who don't know me, I'm Matthew Gillam. I work with Claire's New York office, Japan Local Government Center. Among my other duties, I've worked with JET and JETAA now since about the year 2000. So I've done this a while. And what I'm going to talk about today is really the history of this, of JETAA, based both on the records that I inherited from my predecessor and then on my own records and experience. So it is very much US centric. So for all of you, that's perfect. For other countries, less so.
Good, Matt, can you see whether you have your sharing rights now?
Yes, I have my rights. Now let's see if I can get this thing to work. Hang on. Let's see. Also, there we go. Can you see that?
We can, Matt.
Thank God, because my computer's a little slow and derpy sometimes, much like its owner. All right, now if I can just get the text to come up, then, okay, hang on. All right, so today, yeah, like I said, I'm just gonna go over the history as context for Paige and Shannan, who are real voices from a lot of this history. So I'm thrilled to have them today. I've worked with them forever and they're fantastic and very knowledgeable people. For JETAA, as you all know, JET began in 1987 after its 2 predecessors, the Monbusho English Fellows Program and the British English Teachers Scheme, were consolidated and expanded. The JET Alumni Association was created in 1989 as a joint initiative between AJET and Claire. 2 main objectives were to provide a support network for participants after leaving the program and to allow Claire to maintain contact with this alumni community as part of Japan's efforts to strengthen its international ties. AJET and Claire worked together to create the original 1989 set of bylaws called the Regulations of the JET-AA, which laid out the basic structure of the organization with national representatives and regional alumni associations, which is what they called chapters. And it designated target cities for chapter formation. So today I want to talk about how JETAA has evolved from there and grown into the JETAA ecosystem, or the JETAsphere, to use Stephen Horowitz's term, that we'll all be focusing on this weekend. This is just a quick timeline that Megan kindly threw together that shows some of the major points I'm going to cover today. The first chapters were formed from 1989 into the early 1990s, and they carried on activities over the next few years in many cities around the country. While target cities for chapter formation were designated in the 1989 bylaws, most people seem to have been unaware of these. And chapter formation appears to have happened fairly organically as ex-JETs returned home and started networking with their fellow alumni, using contact information provided by Claire and MOFA. The chapter jurisdictions that we still use today are based on the embassy and consulate jurisdictions that existed at that time. These have carried over even if some consulates were closed. And the newest chapter, Music City, was formed after the consulate was moved from New Orleans to Nashville. Hang on, let's see. Here we are. I skipped a slide, sorry. After the consulate was moved from New Orleans to Nashville around 2008. For anyone who's interested in these early days, you can access back issues of JET streams on the JET program website, jetprogram.org, for information on reporting from the chapters from 1990 onward, basically. All right. Now the first JETAA International Conference was held in 1995 in New York. The director of Japan Local Government Center, Mr. Otaki, wanted to learn about the chapter's activities and give them a chance to exchange ideas among themselves. The entire conference was funded by Claire, as were the second in San Francisco and the third in Montreal. The original conference format centered around the North American chapters, with 4 representatives from overseas, from Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and the UK, first invited to the Montreal conference in 1987 as observers. From the 1998 conference in Atlanta, MOFA also started to provide more support. The 1997 Montreal conference apparently had the first discussion about creating an international JETAA identity. And the name JETAA International first appears in reporting from the 1998 Atlanta conference. By the 5th conference held in Los Angeles in 1999, there had developed a strong consensus to also make the conference truly international by holding it in places outside of North America and including representatives from all countries with viable chapters as full participants in an independent, self-governing organization with its own bylaws written by alumni. As JETAA developed, the grant and aid system for chapters was established by Claire in 1998 to introduce continuity and accountability into Claire funding and facilitate long-term support for alumni efforts. GIA for conferences and for country representatives came later. The creation of bylaws for JETAA International and chapters was reportedly driven largely by Claire as a prerequisite for receiving this funding, although Claire's relationship with JETAA was rather ambivalent at first. The first JETAA International bylaws were introduced in 1999. They were reportedly based on the Houston chapter bylaws. Also, around this time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs demanded a greater role in the conference, advancing the shift away from its being mainly a Claire alumni event. The 2000 conference, held in Tokyo, along the lines of the 1999 conference, with all international chapters participating as full voting members, was the first of these new conferences. The 2000 conference also had the first recorded election of JETAA executive officers. From the 2001 conference in London, JETAA began wrestling with the issue of scaling down and rethinking its annual conference and its entire organizational structure. Because of the increasingly severe fiscal situation in Japan and indications that funding and support could no longer be maintained at the levels enjoyed up to that point. By 2004, it had been decided that the international conferences would be replaced by international meetings, with only the country representatives attending. It was agreed that if possible, full conferences would be held every 5 years. At this point, chapters stopped voting directly and entrusted that function to their country representatives. The international conferences, just to note, had representatives from every chapter plus the country representatives. They were big affairs. The London conference had 2 representatives from every chapter. The last international conference was held in Nagoya and Kobe in 2005. After that, only international meetings were held, and in 2010, MOFA announced it would no longer provide funding, since they did not see any value coming from the annual gatherings. One more was held in 2011, however, in Tokyo, utilizing funding from Claire and the Japan Foundation. After that, what we call JETAA 1.0 ceased to function. As the international conferences grew away from being basically a meeting of North American chapters and became a much larger, more truly international affair, the Canadian and American groupings of chapters and JLGC New York decided it would be worthwhile to hold smaller, more regionally focused meetings. So in 2000, JLGC held a North American workshop in New York for all US and Canadian chapters. And the West Coast chapters, Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, Northern California, and Southern California, held their own regional conference in Seattle. In 2001, the 7 Canadian chapters held their first Canadian conference in Edmonton. Roughly half the US chapters held an Eastern Regional Conference in Philadelphia, and JLGC held a second North American workshop in New York. In 2002, the Canadians held their second annual conference in Winnipeg, and the US chapters held their first US National Conference in Chicago. Just to note, Sydney also hosted the first regional conference for Oceania in 2000. There was a series of Far Eastern conferences held from 2003 to 2007, and 2 European conferences in 2004 and 2006. The Asian and European conferences faded out, but North America and Oceania have continued to have regular annual meetings. By 1998, the record shows chapters being assigned the standard numbering system that we still use, which is very close to the original 1989 chapter numbers. But the country reps didn't really play any role outside of the actual conferences themselves, although the bylaws did task them with facilitating communication between JETAA and the chapters and serving on the executive committee made up of all country reps. At this stage, JETAA was seen as the unifying umbrella organization. The idea of JETAA USA as a collective body between the chapters and JETAA grew slowly over many years. The term JETAA USA was first used in 2005, and the organization was only codified as a formal entity with adoption of the bylaws in 2012. Functionally, however, the American alumni have been working as a national group for even longer, having closely followed the lead of the Canadian alumni, who first decided to hold their own national conference and began working together as a collaborative grouping on various cross-chapter projects back in 2001. From the early 2000s, the US alumni worked to develop and strengthen the nascent national organization through codifying and enforcing an evolving set of guidelines, usually called roles and responsibilities for the country reps. This was partly due to the increasing workload being asked of them, and partly due to a number of people who took on the country rep position, but then failed to follow through on their commitments. It became even more important after a wrenching national incident in 2009, 2010, concerning allegations of malfeasance by a country rep during his time as a chapter officer, which eventually resulted in his removal from office. The effort to strengthen the national network was given further urgency by two major events: calls for the JET program to be reduced or eliminated after the Democratic Party of Japan took power in 2009, and the devastation of 3/11. Supporters and past participants of the JET program were central in responding to criticism of the program by the DPJ and efforts to justify reducing or ending it through the Jigyo Shiwake government spending review process that the party initiated after taking power. And alumni in various positions in the US helped coordinate this response. Sometimes referred to as the JET threat, the DPJ position on the program destroyed any sense of complacency that, despite its shortcomings, JET would continue to be there for its participants and for the US-Japan relationship. Fortunately, the dangers seemed to recede once Prime Minister Khan reaffirmed the importance of JET in November 2010, and certainly by the time Secretary of State Clinton spoke in support of it in October 2011. What's more, after regaining power in 2012, the Liberal Democratic Party under Prime Minister Abe announced plans to expand JET. Let's see, and sometime after this, the Tokyo metropolitan government announced it would increase its participation from 5 jets to over 200, sorry. And this development was thanks very much to the efforts of Monica Yuki and Jitani, and to George Rose and the New York Yankees. That's a whole story in itself. Hang on, let's see. Overlapping the latter stages of the JET threat, the triple disasters of March 11th, 2011 saw both current and former jets mobilizing from that very day to set up fundraising drives, search efforts on the ground in Tohoku, relief operations, and information sharing networks to respond to the unprecedented scale of destruction. JET alumni were also crucial to the activities of the US Embassy in Tokyo following the disasters. There were 124 alumni working in the embassy at one point, where they filled positions from top aides to Ambassador Ruse to staff on the ground in Tohoku supporting Operation Tomodachi. Alumni in the US, motivated partly by the fact that 2 American jets died in the tsunami, raised almost $90,000 through the JETAA USA Relief Fund, and at least $313,000 more through other chapter drives. And this does not include the tens of thousands of dollars raised by the Canadian chapters or other alumni around the world. Fundraising in the US was made more difficult, however, by the lack of any central nonprofit entity to handle the donations, requiring a workaround where JETAA New York, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, handled them on behalf of JETAA USA at considerable discomfort to itself. With the realization of what they could accomplish as a group, the alumni community, with the support of Claire and other elements of the Japanese government, launched renewed efforts to create effective mechanisms to organize the alumni and their chapters in order to increase their capacity for coordinated action in pursuit of various goals. These efforts followed 2 parallel paths. One path that built on the work that had been done up to then produced the JETAA USA bylaws, strengthening the existing national organization by better codifying its functions and creating the board of advisors for additional support. The other led to the national capacity building project that resulted in US JETAA, a national nonprofit to provide the services that the all-volunteer unincorporated JETAA USA could not. The two entities are mutually supporting and fulfill complementary roles, and citing one without the other would miss the full range of alumni accomplishment in the United States. It should also be noted during this time, JETAA International ceased functioning in any meaningful way, and the alumni network became comprised of only chapters, with some organized into national or regional groupings. International alumni communication, however, continued through the JET International Google group created by Stephen. This group was the bridge to the creation of JETAA 2.0 in 2015. As mentioned, JETAA USA has evolved over the last 20 years or so to more effectively coordinate activities, disseminate information, and act as the collective voice of the alumni in the US. However, even as JETAA USA developed, it became clear there were limits to what it could do, especially in terms of providing continuity and handling money, since it is not a legally incorporated entity and depends wholly on volunteers who serve year to year. It also did not have any central point of contact beyond the Washington, D.C. chapter with the US side of the US-Japan relationship or with the federal government in the way that it had with its connections to Tokyo through Claire and MOFA. Paige Cottingham-Streater, Executive Director of the US-Japan Bridging Foundation, among her many other roles, and a JET alumna who helped start some of the original chapters in the US. Along with other people active in the US-Japan relationship, recognized the value of the alumni and the fact that they were not being effectively utilized as a resource for the US-Japan relationship. She therefore set out to explore the creation of a federally recognized 501c3 nonprofit corporation that could raise funds, hire staff, and work to build greater capacity for the alumni to carry out their various efforts in support of Japan, its relationship with the US, the JET program, and the alumni community. She then presented a proposal to JETAA USA at the National Conference in San Francisco in 2012 to work toward creating some type of national organization. A working group consisting mostly of JET alumni was formed immediately following the conference to consider Paige's proposal and how best to support it. The working group advised and assisted in assembling and implementing a plan for the proposed organization and in gaining the chapter's agreement to and support for it. This work was grounded in the collective experience of the participating members, who had been engaged with building and strengthening the alumni community for years already. Ultimately, after 3 years of working group meetings, chapter visits, updates, and working sessions at the national conferences, and securing federal nonprofit status, US JETAA was formally established in 2015 and immediately turned its attention to developing programs to support alumni as individuals and in chapters. In 2017, they held their big inaugural event, the JET 30 reunion in Washington, D.C., which was a lot of fun. Since then, under Paige's guidance, US JETAA has worked under its first executive director, Laurel Lukashevsky, and then Bahia Simons Lane to cultivate the funding and programs that will allow it to carry out its mission. And now we wait to see who will step in and lead the next stage of its work.
Matt, just hopping in for a little time check. We have about 25 minutes, so we'll want to make sure that we can get Paige and Shannon up soon.
I am almost done.
I know. I love you.
Thanks. Finally, one of the most fundamentally important elements of the alumni community has been JETWIT, the JET Writers, Interpreters, and Translators group created by Stephen in 2008. It was a product of his frustration with longstanding efforts to create a national JETAA newsletter to improve the process of sharing job listings, articles, updates on activities, and a whole range of other items of interest to current and former JETs. Working from the philosophy that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, he launched JETWIT himself and then announced it to the alumni community, encouraging everyone to make use of it. And even now, with the explosion of other online communication channels, it's still a go-to source for information and one of the most recognized channels of alumni communication and information. Stephen's been involved in a lot of things I think you'll hear about in the Board of Advisors session. I will just say that in 2011, based on his work with the Tohoku disaster response, Stephen and JETWIT received a formal certificate of appreciation from the Japanese government through Claire. And this is perhaps the future. This is just following on my earlier slides, illustrating how the ecosystem could change again, depending on the outcome of your discussions here this weekend. Here quickly are some resource banks maintained by Claire and JETAA International. They really don't cover the US or specific countries, but there is a lot of information here, and we will try to get more information online as we are able to. All right, this has been a very broad overview. Thank you. If you're interested, I look forward to answering questions. Sorry about that. During the session at the end of this after Paige and Shannon. Thank you very much.
Matt, thank you so much. I'm sure you weren't keeping track of the chat, but you have a lot of people really interested in this content. So thank you so much, first of all, for keeping track of all of this for us over the years and teaching us about our history. And of course, you'll continue into the discussion. I do want to invite Paige and Shannon to unmute themselves and turn their cameras on. I'm pretty informal, so I will introduce you very briefly and then allow you both to give your own introductions after that. So Paige Cottingham-Streater, of course, we heard is instrumental in the formation of our early chapters, as well as US JETAA, and is also highly decorated by the Japanese government. We're very honored to have you here with us, Paige, both today and speaking tomorrow on behalf of US JETAA. And Shannan Spisak is joining us. I'm a little bit giddy about this. Shannan is our CR predecessor and has some really amazing experiences in the 2008 era where our organization was really trying to develop its own personality and structure. So please feel free to give yourselves a brief introduction. And then Paige, I will start us off by asking you to talk a little bit about the formation of those early chapters.
Sure, Megan, thank you so much. And Matt, you know, bravo. That's a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time. And I was reflecting on each period that you spoke about. I really wanted to just acknowledge first this wonderful community that I've enjoyed being a part of for such a long time, and all of the people who are here today, but also the people who have been part of that history. We've done this work together, and I'm looking forward to building our future together as well. I was in early JET. I joined the program when it was in its second year. I had already graduated from law school and was working as a lawyer for the US government and studying Japanese in the evening after having been an Asian studies major and trying to figure out how am I going to sort of pursue this interest in Japan and have a satisfying and meaningful professional career. And I learned that the Japanese government was going to pay for people to teach English in Japan. So I took a leap of faith. I went off, I did it. I was in NatCon and really just had a wonderful experience, challenging as it was. I learned a lot and learned that I really wanted to be more deeply involved in being that bridge between the two countries. And I decided I needed to come back because I could imagine a life involving Japan, but not necessarily a long-term commitment teaching English in Japan. And Claire offered those JETs who were returning an opportunity to raise their hand and say if they were interested in being a part of an alumni network. And we didn't really know what that would involve, what it would look like. But I took the train to Tokyo from Miyake-ken and met with Scott Ollinger, who was in the Clare office at the time, and really just had a conversation with a handful of people that said, you know, I'm happy to help. But there was no manual or guidebook on what that involved and what it would look like. So we were literally, you know, building the plane and flying it at the same time. So I returned to Washington, D.C., and basically went to the place where I started for my interview and asked the consulate there if maybe we could, A, have a room, a space to be able to meet the handful of us that we were. And then secondly, could they provide us with a list of names of people who left from Washington, D.C.? It was such a small group of Americans who were participating at that time and departing from different cities. It wasn't terribly difficult to get the information of who left. As we all know, that hasn't changed today. It's still challenging to get the information of who's come back and knowing where they are. But, you know, I was able to at least enlist and identify a handful of people who wanted to meet regularly. And that's what I don't think has changed over 30 something years. We Jets have a shared experience, and we want to share that with each other, talk about it with each other, and stay connected to Japan in some way. I've been fortunate to be able to maintain a consistent relationship with Japan through my professional work, but it's the JET alumni community that's really kept me and tapped me to be able to bring Japan back here to the United States. So those early sort of formative years of the chapters were literally a handful of people meeting over sushi at the generosity of the Japanese government, the embassies, the consulates. I had a friend who was on JET who had also returned from California, Cynthia Leffler in Los Angeles. There was another woman up in New York. We started Washington first. We used the telephone and shared information about what we were doing, how we were doing it, what we were facing. And it basically bloomed and blossomed from there. I've said a lot, so I want to leave time for Shannan and other of your questions. But really, that was the beginning. Just really a desire, a personal desire to give back and to stay connected and build and watch something grow.
Fantastic, Paige. Thank you. Shannan, Paige had mentioned, and I quote, there was no manual or guidebook, and that they were flying the plane while building it, which are both fantastic quotes. Those really speak to some of the conversations that you and I were having as we were preparing yesterday. Can you explain how that is true also of your experience and what that was like for you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think when Paige mentioned that, I was thinking in my head, yeah, we were trying to build that guidebook. I think, you know, I feel like, you know, the time frame that I stepped into JET was, you know, post Paige, where there was somewhat of a framework, but it still really felt like we were trying to figure out what we are as an organization. I think New York was a pretty established chapter at that point. No surprise, we had a lot of alumni there. For me personally, I didn't leave from New York. I left from a different location and ended up in New York. So, you know, my connection and my interest was around, what do I do in this new place? Where is my network? How do I get a job? And we were lucky in New York, as Matt has referenced, like we're in the same city as JLGC. They had office space there. We were able to have meetings and sort of construct some framework of progress based out of like a physical location, which is really important, I think, when you're trying to establish you know, regular meetings and a space where people are coming together. And so we were, you know, when I stepped into the presidency, it was a little bit of a unexpected. We had elections, and the president of the New York chapter had a change in his life, and he left the city, and I was the vice president at the time. And so, you know, with Stephen and a lot of the other JET alumni in New York at that time, we really worked hard to kind of create what we felt was gaps in some of the structure of the organization. What were these roles and responsibilities? Were we a 501c3? What were our articles of incorporation? You know, some of these things that as a chapter you feel like this is maybe really boring, and why do we have to do this? But in terms of being a representative organization and having a connection, formal connection with Japanese government and funding that they were offering to the Alumni Association for support, it was really important to have a structure that was centered around how we could operate both in partnership with our funders, but also with the local alumni that were coming back and that wanted to connect and that we wanted to build a community with. And so I think, for me, seeing sort of the New York chapter and the national level of the organization, and then realizing that these international conferences that had been happening were slowing down and tapering off, the question started to become, how do we represent so many of our local chapters at a national level when not everyone is able to go to these larger meetings and conferences?
I think this is a question for both or all of you. We as current chapter leaders are so used to structure just being there, right? And there are those of us who still feel like there's not enough structure. But at the end of the day, we really benefited a lot from the work that the two of you have put into building structure along the way. So GIA has always been here. Claire has always supported us. NatCon has always existed. But there was a time when they didn't. I think that allows us to kind of disconnect a little bit from the meaning of all of those things. So could you guys talk a little bit to the relationship that you had with our supporting organizations at the time and what that meant to you, how that gave you real purpose to your activity in JETAA? Either one of you, please.
So I might jump in and start because thank you, Megan. You made a point of something that I wanted to share, which was that right now we have what seems to be a well-oiled machine, or at least, on the surface of things. But certain things didn't necessarily always exist. And so we had to think about, all right, what is our purpose? And then how do we want to go about that? And what are the resources that we need? And so maybe getting those resources meant either getting them from ourselves as individuals or partnering with other organizations. So in Washington, D.C., we recognized that we wanted to be together. And so we wanted an opportunity for space to gather. We wanted maybe to socialize, and have, some funds for meals, recognizing when people come back, they're also trying to figure out what to do next. And so they wanted some professional development support or career guidance. And so what activity could we do? So we thought about, who do we know in this sort of Washington, D.C. world? A lot of people interested in law or public policy or education or nonprofit work. And so we sort of honed in on what we had the capacity to do, and tried to meet regularly. We also tried to provide some service. And so we invited in maybe a speaker, or we had over time like a career panel. And we tapped into our own networks, but also the networks of others around us. We actually chipped in. We had long conversations about dues, and people did make financial individual contributions. And now I'm getting feedback from myself. But the lawyer in me, frankly, was not comfortable because we didn't have a separate bank account in collecting that money and having it commingled. So we stopped that, and we just sort of went to a sort of like each event occasion, sort of pitching in. But we also, yes, partnered with the embassy for the space. We partnered with the embassy for the in-kind contribution of the food. We also went to some of the other area institutions. And so really first identifying what we wanted to do, what we wanted to accomplish, and then figuring out who had the resource that we needed that they could provide in some way. I also just want to say that we wanted to somehow be paying back to the program. And so when we had these interview panels, it didn't always look like that. The screening process, the reading of applications didn't always look like that. There wasn't always a JET member represented on the panel. That was something we thought was important to do. We've had the experience, and we should be part of the screening process. And we also wanted to go out and help with the recruitment. So just figuring out where the need is and how we can step in a reasonable way without, you know, burning ourselves out. Although we know that happens at JET, right?
Shannon, please, your comments.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, I think it was very similar, the evolution in the New York chapter of sort of trying to decide where you wanted to focus efforts. And again, recognizing that everyone was a volunteer, recognizing that the alumni, you know, as a community might be interested in different things, and some would skew much more social and some would skew more professional. And how do we find the right partnerships? I think, you know, for us in New York also, there was sort of this recognition of like, oh, wait, people are going to give us money, people meaning like our Japanese partners, like how do we structure ourselves in this question of bank accounts? Like it can't be to a personal account. So how do we structure, you know, a chapter or an organization to be representative of a group and not just an individual person? And so there was a lot of conversation at that point, you know, with the chapter and trying to work that out. And I think the other component that I wanted to mention, especially as we talk about working with partners and sort of creating impact from the partnerships that we had, something that was important to me as I came in to the Alumni Association was consistency of events. It sort of seemed, and again, this is another, you know, it results in having volunteers, but, you know, someone coming in new wondering, how can I be involved? And it's like, well, this month we have this thing, but then something might not happen for a while. And can we look year after year and say, well, every year we're going to have this networking event, and every year we're going to do this particular, you know, type of activity, and creating some expectation around that, and building within our alumni some interest, but also some accountability, and having someone say, I'll step up and do that for that particular purpose. And so I think for us, there was also creating this reliability maybe within, you know, what is a volunteer organization, not just for our alumni members, but also for our funding partners to say, yeah, we're responsibly using this money. We understand that, you know, the purpose of this is to perpetuate what experience we had, you know, in Japan while we're back here in the US.
Well, thank you both for helping to hoodwink them into believing that we were trustable with their Japanese tax dollars.
Yeah, I'll just say from the Claire side quickly that, you know, looking back on this time, we wanted to support everybody, but, you know, for Claire, at least, we really didn't know how.
Yeah.
And JET for me was really seasonal in the early years. You know, when the meetings came around in the summer, I was busy, but the rest of the year, there was really nothing to do. So we just left it to all of you to actually go out and do your thing. So it was really hard to provide real support or guidance, because nobody on the Claire side, certainly myself included, understood what you might need to help you, you know, accomplish these things. And that's one thing that's taken many, many years to sort of figure out. And it was a lot of conferences and a lot of years of, oh, how do you make a bank account, make standardized email addresses? Who had a successful activity? How did you host it? Who had an unsuccessful activity? Why was it a disaster? You know, just over and over, year after year, was a lot of this discussion.
And Megan, go ahead.
Please.
Well,
No,
I'm
please.
just going to follow up on Matt's comment, and also as I think about what Shannon and I are both speaking about, we're talking about Washington, we're talking about New York. Those are chapters in large cities, but they're also chapters that have a larger geographic area. And I think, wearing my US JETAA hat, I think it's worth noting, and I don't want the people on the call who are from those sort of further out remote, more remote communities to feel, well, we don't have that, or we didn't have that opportunity. In the early years, we thought about what to do about Philadelphia, because, you know, is it New York's? Is it Washington, D.C.'s? You know, and so it's important that we also think about who are our members and how can we tap into everybody so that everybody can feel like they can be involved in some way. And that's one of the gaps, as Matt was talking about, what do the chapters need, is being able to, you don't need to replicate efforts, you can share experience. And US JETAA has been able to be in that place and position to be able to support all of the chapters, share best practices. Hopefully it levels the playing field maybe, and gives the maybe smaller chapters, whether it's by the location where they are or the number and the size, that opportunity to have a robust programming, still based on their unique needs for their community, but we can share the resources that we have to offer as a national organization.
Paige, I love that. And that actually puts us into the last topic that I wanted to guide us into today.
Okay.
But first off, thank you. I know I see many of my small chapter friends out there. I'm a small chapter leader myself. Mid-South has greatly benefited from the resources that US JETAA has made available for small chapters. So we are really appreciative for that. We've talked a great deal, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for what you have done to shape our organization and to create the structure that we have today. We literally wouldn't exist without you. But we don't exist in a vacuum. We have done a lot to kind of bootstrap our way into becoming a real organization, but we exist within a greater context. So, Matt had alluded to and discussed the JET threat and 3/11 and how those events impacted us. And of course, Paige, you run in a much wider world of US-Japan relations. Can you talk a little bit about how we have been impacted by these external events to cause things such as our formalization into JETAA USA or the creation of US JETAA and other important events that have been catalyzed in response to external pressures?
Shannon, I feel like I'm talking a lot. Do you want to go first or go ahead?
Yeah, and I feel like, my comments might be a little bit more brief from the perspective of those external events within my time frame. I would say we're more funding associated. And so on one hand, what we were shaping and what we were trying to build was in effect a result of saying there's funding available. How are you as an organization structured to receive this and use this and be accountable for it and report back to us? And at the same time, as Matt was explaining, the amount of funding that was available to bring individuals together, bring chapters together on an international basis was being reduced. And so we sort of had gone from, not as part of the Alumni Association's decision, but we had gone from circumstances where it was a very open invitation for chapters to come together and have discussions to a point where the funding partners and the alumni were then being asked, how are we getting impact from the money that we're investing, in these events and opportunities so that we can either continue to share with the funding organizations why it should continue to get funded. And if that's not happening, then what do we do to still remain connected without that level of funding that had been available to us in the past? And so I think, for us at the time, it was really looking critically at these country representative roles and knowing that if fewer individuals are coming together to discuss what's happening in our chapters and how to move forward and what's helpful to us, how are we determining as a large country with a lot of chapters who those individuals should be and what should their roles and responsibilities be? And when Matt, mentioned that in his history, we were creating roles and responsibilities documents. What kind of accountability did we want as an organization for those individuals that were going to represent us in larger conversations where external factors were affecting, what was happening maybe at the local level or what could happen at the local level?
Very good. Shannon, thank you so much. Paige, why don't you round us out in our last 2 minutes with your closing comments?
Sure. So I'll just simply say, particularly as we're reflecting on our history and thinking about our future, to recognize that, yes, we are a community, we have our own ecosystem, but we are a part of a larger US-Japan community. And that community in both the US and Japanese governments knows about JET, respects JETs, appreciates JETs, and is looking to leverage this community to support and sustain that US-Japan partnership. When Matt was talking about President Clinton's reference of support for JET alumni, it's because there are more than 250 JET alum who are at the State Department who are able to both demonstrate the value of their knowledge about Japan, but also get the ear and be in decision-making positions. We are in every community, in every sector of society that matters to Japan. So whether you're part of the bilateral relationship or whether you're educating a next generation of people about the world and Japan as part of that, or if you're in the business sector or science, there's no area these days where you won't find a JET alum. And the US government recognizes that, the Japanese government recognizes it, and wearing my Colcon hat back in 2012, it was actually memorialized in the joint statement that we need to leverage this community and engage this community. So I'm hoping, you know, in the years ahead that US JETAA and JETAA USA and all the local chapters will together be a part of the mutual understanding that motivated us to go to Japan in the first place.
Paige, those are amazing comments to end on. If that doesn't have you fired up for the rest of NatCon, I don't know what would. And you're perfectly on time too. Shannan, Paige, Matt, thank you so much for your time, for helping to form our community, for Matt helping to document our community and teach it back to us as we've lost touch with it over the years. This is an amazing way to start off. And so we're all giving you in our respective homes a round of applause and appreciation for your time. Thank you guys so much. Please.
Huge thanks to you, Megan. I know, and the other country reps, pulling together an event like this is not an easy task. And, you know, again, it's an all volunteer situation. So thank you for creating the space for us to have the conversation.
Thanks for creating the structure, Shannan. We appreciate it. Couldn't have done it without you.
Thanks for giving me a chance to work with these two again also. I always enjoy it. So.
Absolutely. I'm just going to give a few logistics before we go to our 10-minute break.